Hello everybody, we're still here at Manassas, but now we're on the battlefield of Bull Run, also called First Bull Run, also called First Manassas, also called Battle of First Manassas. Call it what you will. This is where we are. We're talking about July of 1861. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. As soon as you see this, go ahead and share this with your friends so we can make sure we get as much jazz as possible. We hope that you are being well and safe at home if you're sequestered or working, whatever you're doing. We hope you enjoy this little broadcast. We're going to bring on a couple of guests and we're going to talk about the battlefield, ask us questions as we go along. Let me first bring on, if I may, Chris White, who's going to give, he's still tapping away on his phone. I bet you he's sharing it with his friends right now. He is listening to what you're supposed to do. So we're going to be talking about the Battle of First Bull Run, and it is not the first thing that happens in the Civil War. It's not remotely the first thing. And to get some of that context, I'm just trying to fill words here until Chris comes walking up. We're going to bring Chris White on. Chris White, Education Manager at the Trust. Go ahead.
Hey everybody, welcome to our quarantine edition of a Facebook Live as we all social distance out here on the Manassas battlefield. So to give you an idea of where we are, we're on the central location known as Henry House Hill. Doug Ullman will bring us up here and give you a nice orientation to all the points of the battlefield. But to get to Henry House Hill, which is really the climax of the battle here at First Bull Run, July 21st, 1861, we have to back up a few months. So the American Civil War starts on April 12th of 1861 in Charleston Harbor at Fort Sumter. But prior to the Confederate firing on Fort Sumter, both sides were starting to gear up for war. In the years leading up to 1861, Southern governments, Alabama, Georgia, other states are starting to buy arms to arm for this war that is potentially coming across the land. The federal government is starting to send supplies down to places like Pensacola, where you have Fort Pickens. You'll be down to Fort Sumter, Fort Monroe, all kinds of different places throughout the South. But on April 12th, 1861, it all comes to a head. So now we have this war that has come across the land, and President Abraham Lincoln is going to call for 75,000 volunteers, and most of them are going to pour into Washington, D.C. They're going to come from all over the North, and they are going to start to congregate there. In the South, the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, will start having armies congregate here in Northern Virginia. We'll have one army that goes out into the Shenandoah Valley. That'll be under Joe Johnston. We'll have another army in this area around Manassas Junction. That's under Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. Beauregard is in charge of the Army of the Potomac, which is greatly confusing because the Union is the Army of the Potomac, not at this battle. At this battle, the Confederates, we're going to call them the Army of the Potomac. We'll switch our names a little bit later on. But the Union commander here in the Eastern Theater won't be George McClellan just yet. It'll be a guy named Irvin McDowell. McDowell is going to put together a force of about 35,000 to 40,000 Union troops around D.C., and he is tasked by the president to start marching his way into the South and to try to force the capitulation of the Confederate armies that are starting to form here around Manassas. That's the idea. Now, in Western Virginia, today West Virginia, George McClellan, another guy named William Rosecrans, they're going to be campaigning through West Virginia. We'll have our first land battle on June 3rd, 1861 at Philippi, and then we will start shifting the focus here to Manassas. And the Union Army will start to move out of Washington, D.C. at a glacial pace. This is an army that is ill-trained. It's not all that well equipped yet, and as they start marching down towards Beauregard's men who are in this area, initially the Confederates will be outnumbered greatly. But due to some inept commanders, a guy named Robert Patterson out in the Shenandoah Valley, we are going to have a free hand for the Confederates, and we're going to use the rail lines that are here, and we'll start shifting Joe Johnston's forces to the Manassas area to reinforce Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, which is just a fun name to say. Then, on the morning of July 21st, it's a Sunday morning, out of Washington, D.C. will come a lot of diplomats and high-ranking officials, as well as the Society of Washington, down here to the plains of Manassas, where we're going to watch the great battle. This one great battle that will quell this rebellion and end it all in one fell swoop. That morning, the same morning at 2:30 in the morning, Irvin McDowell's command will start marching their way down towards Manassas, and they will come up with a battle plan. The idea will be to hold the Confederates in position along Bull Run. Well, a force comes in behind me, swings across Bull Run, comes across a few hills that Doug will describe to you, and starts to try to sweep Beauregard's men out of here. It's a taxing march. It's going to be a night march. Even veteran soldiers have problems with night marches during the Civil War. Now you have a Green Army making their march down here, so it's going to be a long, drawn-out process to get the Union Army here, and by the time the battle kicks off on the morning of Sunday, July 21st, 1861, they're already going to be very tired. And I'm going to kick it over to Doug to start kicking us off with the battle here.
All right, so as Chris made reference to, they call this the Plains of Manassas. Large expanses of open rolling hills. Because of modern development and the major roads and highways running through this area, it's very easy to lose track of the fact that this ground is very hilly with lots of elevation that's going to make it difficult for armies to move over long distances, especially on a hot summer day like July 21st, 1861. So, as we mentioned, we're standing here on Henry Hill, named for Judith Henry, who lived in the house just in front of me over here. The Henry House, this is a reconstruction of the wartime structure, which was on this spot. Judith Henry, an old widow, lived in this house, and she, we'll get into later, died during the battle and was actually buried here on Henry House Hill. When we think of the battlefield at Manassas for First Bull Run, we want to think primarily of three major features of the battlefield. Three major features of the battlefield, which are going to be Henry Hill, where I now stand, Matthews Hill, which is to the north, and then over to the west, Chin Ridge. And that's not going to factor in until much later in the battlefield. But those are the major hills that the armies are going to be marching over. As Chris referenced, the Confederates are basically lining across Bull Run and holding the position to my east. As that is happening, a portion of the Union Army is going to go around to the north and then come down from the north along a Sudley Road in that direction, coming down across Matthews Hill. It is at this point that a guy that you've probably heard of, Edward Porter Alexander, the only signal officer in the Confederate Army practically, is going to see this movement and, for the first time that we are aware of, use flags to signal information to troops on the ground. He's going to send a message to Jubal Early, who is out guarding the stone fort along the stone bridge, along Bull Run, and he's going to send a message that says, "Look out for your left, you are turned." And at that point, the Confederates know that the Federals have found their left flank and are coming down Matthews Hill from the north, and then Confederates are going to move to break that attack.
Great. Thank you, Doug. Good to see Drew Gruber. We were just talking about you earlier, man. And Amber Lass is back, and I can see a few other good friends. So thank you for joining us. You're with the American Battlefield Trust, and we're at the Bull Run or Manassas Battlefield. We're talking about the first battle here in July of 1861. Make sure you share this with your friends. Hope you're all being well and safe. So Doug just mentioned that E.P. Alexander noted and saw the glistening of the Union equipment as they outflanked the Confederates. And Shanks Evans, at positions at the Stone Bridge, is going to make the decision. Okay, they're coming up my rear. I better move most of my soldiers over to Matthews Hill. That's the next rise behind me there. He can't exactly get on top of the hill, so he selects the reverse slope. In other words, you might be able to see two fences over my shoulder in the distance. He takes the first one and actually starts launching attacks against the Union. The Yankees are twice as numerous, then 3 times as numerous, and Evans continues to attack in that direction. Evans is a colorful guy. He always has a barrelita of whiskey carried by his staff, so that guy can just get going whenever he wants to. And Shanks Evans is launching these attacks. And at this important time, a few things are happening. First, Confederate reinforcements arrive, and they're on this hill behind me, not on the far hill, but right distance. And they have to decide whether they're going to go help the Confederates in what proves to be a futile task, what they think will be a futile task, or should they stay back and form position on here. They decide to go and help their friends, but the Union shows up with 2, 3, 4, 6 times more people. And the Union line is extending on Matthews Hill around the Confederates, while the Confederate line is shorter. They keep attacking the Union soldiers, and you have a Confederate named Roberdeau Wheat leading these Louisianians. He is seemingly thought to be mortally wounded, but he hangs on a little bit longer. Eventually, the Confederates will be pushed back to Henry Hill here. This is a disaster. It's just like the Union soldiers said. There's going to be one big battle and it's over. Irwin McDowell in the charge is saying it's over. Victory is ours. And he's going to follow them up this way. But a few things happen. Remember, some of the Confederates hadn't been in this fight yet, so you got Wade Hampton over near what's called the Robinson House, slowing down the Union soldiers. You also have more Confederates arriving in the woods behind the camera. Some of them have arrived from the other fords. Some are coming from the train movement that Chris White had mentioned. And all of a sudden, the southern area is getting stronger right when Irvin McDowell should be attacking, but he waits 2 hours at this point. He advances a few skirmishers and whatnot, but there's nothing going on for 2 hours. That gives the Confederates the time they need. And then the fight is going to to begin to devolve upon Henry Hill. Let's see how well Chris White knows the battle for Henry Hill, because I haven't even brought cannons up here yet, Chris.
Yeah, so what you'll be looking at is behind me, over my shoulder with the air support coming in, will be Matthews Hill. On Matthews Hill, you'll have a Confederate resistance for about 90 minutes. It's going to hold the Union forces back until about noon. And from noon until 2, the Confederates are going to get some bonus time, and that's given to them by the Union forces, Irwin McDowell himself, who is going to take a long time to decide what to do next. Now, as this is happening, from the south and coming up towards us will be the Confederates. Confederates will start to deploy, as Gary said, behind me now in those woods. Those woods is where a Virginia brigade coming in from the Shenandoah Valley would be deployed, and that would be under the command of Brigadier General Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Jackson is about to get his nom de guerre, or earn his nom de guerre, Stonewall, here on the battlefield. Supporting him are about 14 cannon. You'll have Granny Pendleton, as they call him, William Pendleton, who eventually becomes the chief of artillery for the Army of Northern Virginia. Jackson is going to deploy his men in the woods in what we call a reverse slope position. That is, he's going to be behind the crest of the hill. This is going to give his men cover and concealment. And once the Union forces start to advance up towards where we're standing, Jackson will be able to rise his men up, move them just slightly forward, and start pouring a fire down the hill. But Jackson is essentially in a static position now, but Confederate brigades will be pressed hard. From his front, you're going to start seeing a guy named Bernard B., who's commanding Georgia troops, and B is going to be the man who somehow gives Jackson his nickname. He's going to say something along the lines of, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall, rally behind the Virginians." Now, some people think that he's saying, there he is standing like a stone wall, why is he moving? Others think it's going to be giving Jackson this name, like, oh, look how stoic he is, we can rally behind the Virginians. So take it however you want. Regardless of what happens, Stonewall Jackson is now larger than life, and that's what I call steroid Stonewall behind us on his big steroided up horse, Little Sorrel. It's a really impressive monument. So we also have a big brigade behind us of Francis Bartow. Bartow is a Georgian. He's from Savannah. His brigade will move down here. Georgia troops with some Kentuckians with them. Bartow will be killed in action, as will Bernard B. So we have two ranking officers going down, but Jackson is still up here. Union forces will start to push forward. They will meet Jackson, and at about 75 yards away, Jackson men will unleash a volley, and he will hit them almost point blank, these Union troops. McDowell, his idea now is to turn into Napoleon himself. Napoleon liked to move his artillery forward and blast open a position. That's what he's next going to do. He's going to move some guns off to my left, try to bring them up to a point-blank range, and blast a hole in Jackson's line, which he will then exploit. This isn't going to work well because he's using rifled cannon, which should be set at a distance, rather than smoothbore cannon, which can do a lot of damage very closely. We're talking about 300 yards. This is point-blank range. And there's such confusion on this battlefield because we're going to have units using different color uniforms. The 2nd Wisconsin, eventually the Iron Brigade, they're going to be wearing gray out here. We'll have battle shirts with the Rhode Islanders under Ambrose Burnside, and pith helmets as well. They're pretty stylish as they come out onto the battlefields. So it's going to be a lot of confusion. Connor?
Okay, if you're talking different uniforms, there's my favorite ever picture of a Confederate who made his own custom leopard pants and matching gun holsters. Just Google it, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it should be like leopard pants, Confederate, hashtag Gary Edelman. So that would be the way to find out. So we have confusion up here. We have a great battery commander named Charles Griffin. Griffin is going to see some troops advancing towards him, and his commanding officer is going to tell him, don't fire on those troops, they're your support. Griffin says, those are Confederates. And Griffin, because he's outranked, loses the argument, and moments later a volley hits Griffin's battery, laying down most of their horses and much of their men. So this is going to turn into a close-fought battle up here, which will eventually turn into a rout for the Union. Who's got what?
Yeah, I got it. Thanks, Chris. So I want to just, what's interesting about this is that Griffin's boss was Major Barry, or his commanding officer was Major Barry, and later, sometime after the battle, Griffin said to him, well, do you think those were my supports now? Like, he really, clapped back at him, and Major Barry's like, no, you might have been right about that. I mean, these are people's lives here. None of us is perfect. In any case, Chris mentioned this Griffin's guns, and that's what really the fight for Henry Hill becomes about. The Union tries to support Griffin's guns, the Confederates capture the guns, then they capture Ricketts' guns, but the Union is pushing back one regiment at a time. You've got William Tecumseh Sherman attacking with 2 regiments at a time. And while the Yankees are wasting attacks with 1 regiment at a time, up come the Confederates with brigade-level returns. Ultimately, the Confederates receive or gain control of this whole position here, the Henry House Hill, and as the Union is getting weaker throughout the day, the Confederates are getting stronger. More reinforcements are arriving in the rear where Joseph E. Johnston is funneling troops to the field. It's really interesting the way him and Beauregard kind of plotted it out. Beauregard's the tactical commander here, and Johnston, who ranks Beauregard by 1 rank. I mean, literally, Johnston is 4th, and Beauregard is ranked 5th of all the generals at the beginning of the war in the Confederacy. Johnston is sending troops over here, and the Confederate line, if the sun doesn't mess with us too much, Connor, is actually extending way out beyond what we call Chin Ridge. That's Chin Ridge is sort of behind me here, and the Confederate line goes way around it, so that when the last Union reserves arrive under Oliver Otis Howard, this is Howard, you hear of him later a little bit. Right now he's a brigade commander, he's got men from New England.
And both arms.
And he's got both arms here. Good, thank you, Doug. And he is going to be on the hottest part of the day with the men least used to the heat, and he is going to be completely surrounded. I mean, he's stacked up like this in the Confederates, cavalry, infantry, early. Other people coming in like this, just on the flank of Howard. They have no chance, and Howard will, for the first time, not the last time in the Civil War, retreat from this position. They do it somewhat orderly. They go back whence they came, and most of the Union forces go back toward Sudley Ford, some crossing closer to the Stone Bridge, and the Confederates, just as disorganized in victory as the Union was in defeat, is they chase. The Union retreat becomes a rout when a bridge, not the Stone Bridge, but the next one over at Cub Run, gets blocked. It becomes a total pandemonium at that point, but the Confederates are too disorganized to push on, and the Union is going to safely get back to Centreville and eventually back to Washington. There's one famous quote that says, actually, that it took 4 days for the Union to advance to Manassas and about 12 hours to get back. Doug?
Guys, I have a question.
Loud.
Question is, when did the armies determine what colors their teams were?
All right,
Was it before or after the coin toss? I don't actually have
it's definitely after. So both the flags and the uniforms are absolutely not figured out at this point, and would not be figured out until at least, I think, the following spring. Chris?
Yeah, so what you'll start to see is the fact that the American flag and the first Confederate flag are very similar to one another. Remember, to some of the Confederates, this is the Second American Revolution. They live here in the United States. They're going to use a very similar flag that you would see used in 1776. So that's what the idea would be behind there. And then you start to get the idea that we have to actually fight a prolonged war. That was the other thing. Most people thought that this would be over maybe in 90 days. Now that we see that this will be a prolonged war, we'll start to see this federalized blue. We'll start to see the Confederates coming out in butternut and gray. Mainly it has to do with dyes, how expensive dyes are in different things at that time. And with the Union blockade, which will eventually smother the South, it becomes very difficult to receive those. The Confederates will change their flag time and time again. So the Confederate flag that you see, the battle flag that you see, is not the only flag that's going to be out here. You'll have state flags that are used as Confederate flags. You'll have the Confederate battle flag. You'll have the Army of Northern Virginia flag, which when they first debuted on a battlefield was a canton of a Confederate flag with a field of white, and it looked like a surrender flag when it was limp without any wind. They actually had to put a red stripe on it so they didn't think that they were surrendering at that point. And then you have, like I said, you have like the 2nd Wisconsin out here wearing gray, and you have Zouaves out here who basically look like marionettes out on the battlefield. MC Hammer pants with baggy pants. They're run off of here by Jeb Stuart and his soon-to-be famous Confederate cavalry. So it'll be a cascade of colors out here. It'll really be everything that you could think of under the sun. So it becomes very confusing. And this plays into all the way in 1862. Whenever A.P. Hill captures Harper's Ferry, some of his troops put on Union blue, march to the Antietam battlefield, and take some Connecticut soldiers by surprise because they thought that they were Union supports, and then they were fired into their flank. So it's a mishmash of not only weapons, but of commanders, flags, and of all of these uniforms that you have out here.
Yeah, and I think this is so cool. It really speaks to, this is the bloodiest battle in American history up to that time. I'll talk about that in a second, but this is also the first battle that most of these guys are fighting in, and certainly the first battle in which any of the generals or even colonels had ever commanded more than 30 or 40 people in. So this is new for everybody. Everybody who could write wrote about this particular battle.
Yeah, William Sherman is actually reading the instruction manual of how to get his guys from a column into a line, because he's never commanded more than 120 men in his life. Now he's a brigade commander here. Yes, William Sherman fought in the Eastern Theater.
So, this is an astounding disaster for the Union Army. Went out with such flusterous victory, seemed like they were going to win in the morning, and in the end, they're going to lose 30 or more of their cannons. The Confederates can claim a huge victory. There are 4,500 casualties in this battle. That's killed, wounded, captured, or missing. That is bloodier than any battle in American history, and that will be exceeded time and again, eventually at, of course, Shiloh, and then by Chancellorsville, and then by Gettysburg, and whatnot throughout the Civil War. Now, remember, these things are made up of actual people. Doug's got in mind to talk about one particular casualty here you might have heard of, and then I'll be back to talk about Judith Henry and the house and whatnot. Doug?
So, first of all, I want to thank everybody for watching, especially our overseas visitors. I want to thank you who are watching from Ireland. Thank you to Burkharson in Sverige. Tak also for being here. Thank you for watching. So we want to say there are a few little interesting vignettes that come out of the first Battle of Bull Run, or Battle of Bull Run, and we can see a lot of them from where we're standing here on Henry Hill. Somebody mentioned bring in the Marines. Well, the United States Marines did fight here on Henry Hill in this vicinity right behind me. They're going to bring up, it's really one of the few times the U.S. Marines are involved in a major land action during the American Civil War. We mentioned the colorful uniforms. We also have, in addition to the blue and the gray and the red battle shirts, you also have plaid, because the 79th New York Highlanders, a Scottish regiment, was wearing their plaid tartan pants and kilts as they're coming up here to fight in Bull Run. Their commanding officer was killed right over here during the assault on Henry Hill. This is one of William T. Sherman's regiments. But the casualty that most people think of, especially if you watch the Ken Burns series, is that of Sullivan Ballou, Major Sullivan Ballou of the 2nd Rhode Island, who wrote that famous letter to his wife Sarah before the battle began, or shortly before the battle began. He was killed here, or died of his wounds that he received here at Bull Run, and that was over on Matthews Hill. You can see the lower of the two fence, or the upper of the two fence lines, all the way towards the trees. That is where the 2nd Rhode Island fought, and that is where Major Sullivan Ballou, the author of this now famous letter to his wife, dear Sarah, that is where he will meet his untimely end. And that is right here on the Bull Run battlefield, just inside of us here from Henry Hill. We had a question about brigades versus regiments and what made a brigade superior to a regiment. That's simply a brigade contains many regiments. So one regiment is basically supposed to be 1,000 men, and a brigade is supposed to be at least 2 regiments. So do the math. 1,000 men, 4 regiments is 4,000 men. A brigade is always going to be superior to a regiment just by sheer numbers. The reason that matters here on Henry Hill is because the Union is only sending 1 or 2 regiments at a time, whereas the Confederates have entire brigades stacked up on this hill, and that's why it seems superior. Guys?
Yeah, and just to talk a minute about what Doug was just saying there, one of the problems that the Union Army runs into is that we have a command and control problem. And it goes back to the fact that no one has commanded an army of this size really in American history. We have about 35,000 Union soldiers here. It's about 10,000 more than George Washington had during the Battle of Long Island, during the American Revolution. 10,000 troops went across Mexico with Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott is probably the best general in the Union arsenal at this point, but he is in his 70s. He's so large that he has to be actually cranked onto his horse on what I would call an engine lift to put him onto his horse. So people weren't taking Old Fuss and Feathers all that seriously. And McDowell, when he comes down here in command, he's going to deploy his men 1 regiment, 1 brigade at a time, very piecemeal fashion, and the Confederates are able to react time and time again. And the fresh reinforcements coming in from Manassas Junction also benefits. But we have just a who's who of officers up here. Gary mentioned Oliver Otis Howard, perhaps one of the worst Union generals to come out of the war.
Oh, come on!
You can't even say that seriously. Stonewall Jackson, who's up here on top of the hill. We have Beauregard, Joe Johnston, who will command armies in the Eastern Theater and in the Western Theater. You have William T. Sherman, Ambrose Burnside. They're not all good, I'm telling you, but we have a lot of different generals up here. We have Wade Hampton, who would have been right here. Isaac Stevens, who eventually rises to the command of general and is killed a few miles away here at Chantilly about a year and a half later. And then you also have Jeb Stuart. So it's a who's who of people. We don't know their names yet. This is where they're starting to earn their nicknames and earn their stripes up on top of these battlefields. And it's going to be here at Manassas where we start to see that we have to really take this war seriously, and we'll start to move men out of positions like a McDowell to get him out of the way, to bring in a George McClellan, who is not a great field commander, but he's a great organizer of men. And then you'll take Beauregard, who is now has some something to add to his resume here at Manassas. We'll send him out west to help support there. So we're starting to get experience. Keep in mind, West Point, you became an engineer. You really weren't trained in the military sciences as you are today. So you go there to become an engineer, and many people go off to become private engineers prior to the war. Many of them will come back here, and West Point graduates will serve on both sides of the war. About 309 Confederate West Point graduates and just over 500 and some for the Union become general officers on each side. So you're going to see a lot of West Pointers up here. This is where they're starting to cut their teeth. Gary?
That's great, and that actually fits in with a question we just got about, why did the two sides do things differently if they both went to West Point and, to VMI and the Citadel? Well, I mean, I think the answer is because we're talking about people. Some people are ready to attack in certain ways. I don't think that at West Point, like Chris said, that they taught division-level assaults or brigade-level assaults when the largest assaults in American history consisted of a couple of regiments. So maybe they thought would be enough. Also, maybe if you've never worked with a brigade, trying to get a brigade online to actually attack is just an impossible feat. So I don't know the answer, but that's a really good one. I wanted to make sure in closing, or close to closing, that we talked a little bit about Judith Henry, because Judith Henry, what we usually know about her is this picture, if you can look here, that shows the ruins of her house. We have no photo of the house before it was ruined because the Union photographers couldn't gain access to this battlefield until March of 1862. The Confederates had been using that wood all winter long, and the house had already been damaged in the battle. But a little bit about Judith Henry. Judith was a Carter. Judith Carter lived over there in a beautiful mansion called Pittsylvania, okay? And then when she came to marry Mr. Henry, she came and lived in this place. It was tiny. I actually have a picture of it. This is not what it looked like at the time. It was much smaller, and it was called Spring Hill. And you can see it in the background of this. So they had tiny houses on this battlefield that had palatial sort of plantation name. So this little two-room house was called Spring Hill, I believe. And at Spring Hill she lived. Mr. Henry has been long gone. She's been a widower for a while, and she wants to stay in the house. But then it gets so dangerous that her son tries to take her away, Hugh Fauntleroy Henry, and they find it much too dangerous. They bring her back to the house. They've got a slave inside, and she is like huddling inside the chimney, and she will be deaf for the rest of her life as a result of the explosions going on in there. Judith Henry will become one of, or the first civilian actually killed in the Civil War, when it is riddled with artillery after the Confederates had been using it as a sharpshooter's nest, or the Union thought so. So that will be riddled. So just to summarize, Judith Henry is born and raised over there at Pittsylvania. She then lives here, and then she is here today. So you can trace the whole course of her life just standing right here, at least location-wise. Hugh Fauntleroy Henry is also there, and somebody asked the question earlier about when this modern house was built. This was not reconstructed by the Park Service to look like Spring Hill or anything. This was reconstructed by, I believe, Hugh Fauntleroy Henry, who still had to live here. This was not a national battlefield park for 80 years or so after the Civil War, or at least 60 years after the Civil War. So this was constructed, I think, in the late 1860s, early 1870s, and then added upon to be made this way. Hugh Fauntleroy Henry offered sort of battlefield tours. He would charge 50 cents for some of these sometimes, not unlike battlefield guides today. And he put signs on trees so that we know when he walked the fields with officers, so we know what happened. And those signs on the trees are now these nice yellow plaques you see around the battlefield here. So thank Hugh Fauntleroy Henry, laying forever right behind me here, for a lot of what we know about this battlefield. Doug, question.
A couple of questions.
Come on.
Were there any innovations at Bull Run that were notable? Any innovations?
Were there any innovations? Well, the most notable one at Bull Run, in terms of it was a first in wartime, and that is using locomotives, trains, to get troops to a battlefield, and especially in this case, decisively. That's one that comes to mind. Chris, any others? Oh, the 30-pounder Parrott, I think, hadn't been used in the field before, and it opened this particular battle. The idea of signal flags being used by the Confederate government, that is the first thing. Chris, anything else come to mind?
I don't think it's so much innovations, and the Europeans were doing a lot of the stuff we were doing here in Crimea about 10 years prior to this, including using the railroads and things. We're just slow to catch up. But what you're going to start to see afterwards is what we've done poorly. We put together a poor army, so we need to restructure it. So we'll go get George McClellan. We're going to start to move away from small arms that are going to be smoothbore. We're going to start buying on large-scale rifled muskets. We're going to try to give a lot more long range here. Jackson's men up on top of Henry House Hill, it was give them the bayonet. That's what Jackson's answer was. But that's not going to be the way to win a war with these new tactics that you're seeing that have to be innovated with all these new technologies. So we'll start to see more adaptations more than you'll see anything else.
All right, a couple more questions. The first was, why was Howard such a bad general? Now, bad is in the eyes of the beholder, and I know Chris will probably disagree with me here. I will say that Howard always finds himself in the worst possible situation and never truly lives up to the best of his abilities. We see that here at First Bull Run, where he finds himself flanked and actually probably doesn't do too terrible. At Chancellorsville, famously, he is flanked by Stonewall Jackson, and his troops are not prepared to receive that flanking attack. At Antietam, he is commanding the 2nd Division of the 2nd Corps, probably one of, if not the very best units in the Army of the Potomac, and he marches them blindly into the West Woods and gets schmacked by these guys. So he's constantly finding himself in the wrong place at the wrong time and not always doing well. I will say that when he goes out west and takes command of the 4th Corps of the Army of the Cumberland during the Atlanta campaign, he does a little bit better there. He does well enough that William T. Sherman is going to promote him to replace James B. McPherson when he is killed at the Battle of Atlanta in July 1864. Now, that might be just because he went to West Point and he didn't want to promote
Joe Hooker?
No, not Joe Hooker, that too. John Logan. He wanted to keep it in the West Point family, but nevertheless, Howard, I think, has a mixed record. The problem is he keeps finding himself in these bad situations and doesn't always get himself out as well as he ought to.
I have a simpler answer for that. He's the epitome of a government employee. You can't fire him, so you have to promote him.
Other question we had...
I kind of like Howard. I'll just say that. He's great on the retreat. Go ahead.
Yeah. Other question we had was, were the locals really watching the battle? Now, when I was younger, one of the first Civil War movies I saw was that miniseries North and South, and there's this great scene where everybody's getting overrun at the Stone Bridge, and there's George Hazard trying to get his family out of the way because all these people are watching. That is an exaggeration of what really happened. The truth is that, yes, there were locals watching the battle, but they were several miles away at Centerville, and the scene that is portrayed in the movie is of Cub Run, not Bull Run, which is a few miles to the east. So there was panic. There were people watching. What they were able to see of the battle is probably very little. They could probably hear the cannons booming, see some smoke from the cannons, but they would not have been able to see the lines of infantry. And I know this because I live on a hill in Centerville, and I can't see this battlefield from my house. Barry.
All right, good. Thank you so much. We're going to wrap things up, but first I have a question for Connor here. So Connor, do we have resources anywhere on social media or on our website that people might be able to access while they might be on quarantine?
Well, you don't say. If you go to our Facebook page, American Battlefield Trust, pinned right at the tippy top of our Facebook page is an exhaustive list of our distance learning resources. So check it out. You can click through to almost anything and take some time to explore our site. There are hidden treasures there, I swear.
You can go on a deep dive and spend the rest of the year just reading the thousands of articles and watching the hundreds of videos that we have on our website, on YouTube, on our lesson plans and whatnot. Dive around, look for something on our site you've never looked for before. If you're an Eastern person, look up the Battle of Munfordville. It's fascinating. If you're more of a Western person, try to get into the Battle of Etham's Landing if we have anything on the website about that. So it's just an endless subject. It can be your life's work just to study this stuff. And even if you're not that nerdy, just watch a couple of videos. I hope you all are being safe. Thanks to Connor and Doug and Chris and Andy, who didn't take any part in this, but thanks Andy nonetheless. He makes most of our videos, by the way. And thank you all. Be safe, and thanks for supporting Battlefield Preservation.